Hey there, this is Jonathan Ross, and in the following tutorials we're going to take a look at cell shading in Flash. Now we're going to be talking about cell shading vector art. Found a nice tutorial on karupa.com, and by the way, cell shading can also be spelled C-E-L instead of C-E-L-L. They happen to be using Photoshop in this tutorial, but it's pretty much the same technique, whatever software you use. It begins often with an outline of an object, typically character or some other type of object that's being used, and after that outline is there, you can fill it with color, and the end result of filling it with color kind of looks like this. Now the problem with just filling it with flat colors is that it looks very flat. It doesn't look three-dimensional. And cell shading gives you the appearance of light and dark so that it makes something look more three-dimensional. They kind of show you a highlight or a close-up version of what it would look like to add some of the cell shading, and here's the end result. You can see that there are some darker areas and lighter areas, and that they're somewhat consistent across the entire character in the way this lighting is applied. And this is to simulate how light hits the object, but it also provides a way for it to be done in vector fairly easily, and also renders very quickly in vector graphics using this technique, which is great. And it's great for characters in Flash, and we're going to show you some really easy ways to do it in Flash. Now this technique is also seen in 3D and all sorts of other things. If you use the plastic shader here, you see that we have some gradients, and if we were to translate that into a threshold where there was no gradient but it just went light and dark, then you'd have basically the results of a toon shader, which looks like this cell shading technique. Now cell shading can be applied to very simple objects like this, or a little bit more extreme, or even a little bit more extreme than that. And one of the things I really like about this one is that it shows you the results of putting the sun in different locations. Here on the right of the character, here on the left of the character, you can see how the shadows move around that character, behind the character, and then in front of the character. Now the position of the light is very important for doing the cell shading because that's basically what you are trying to simulate. Now, there is a nice little tutorial that I found here on jcsantos.com on applying cell shading, and there you can see it spelled differently in Flash. And he uses a couple different techniques, and we'll be looking at these techniques in a little bit. One technique that he uses is by using the rectangle tool. And he draws a rectangle and then he modifies it by pushing and pulling it and then turning it into the cell shading that he likes. Another one is using the line tool, which is one of my favorite ways of doing it. This to me feels a little bit more usable, and it's a little bit easier to control, and we'll take a look at this technique as well when we get to drawing. And then another one is using the brush tool. I would say that it's one of the quickest methods, and he even says that, but I'm not convinced that it is as nice looking as some of the other techniques because you just can't be quite as smooth with the brush typically as you can be. But it can be a nice way of doing things. I'm going to suggest use the line tool, but you know, every time that you draw something, the technique can be different and you can get different results. So let's just take a quick look at the types of objects we can do and what it might look like. We're going to be actually going with an apple as one of our objects to just talk about. And one of the things I like about this apple is that it's very simple, but you can imagine kind of what the cell shading would look like. If I was to go and skip over to cell shaded versions of this apple, you can see here's a very simple version. Here's another one. There's another one with cell shading. And there's another one. And you can even get a little bit more extreme if you're trying to show a little bit more organic qualities. It's still cell shading, but it's really changed how that object looks quite a lot using this technique. Now, another thing to bear in mind, I found this website, or this apple on this website, and I just want to keep in mind that when we draw things, we do need to consider the parts. For example, this thing is a conglomerate of at least 4 different parts. There's actually a little white circle there. But that's going to be important as well, even though we're looking at this technique. So I want to revisit that in the future. Going on, we're actually going to be drawing a cupcake. And I was looking at some of the cupcakes, and I saw which ones I kind of liked. I kind of like that one, and I kind of like this one. And so we're going to kind of mix this one and that one together when we draw it. But just looking at what the object would look like without cell shading versus adding cell shading and different degrees of it really changes the way this thing looks. You can see the subtle cell shading that's been applied here, and it makes that object look really nice. And of course, you can get even more extreme with the cell shading, and you still are kind of using the same technique, and they've also included some gradients in here, but you get really different results by the way that you apply that technique. So let's go on to Flash and look at how we can start to use this. And we're going to go back to our Google search for a cupcake outline. So start there.